everyone. Thank you for coming. The topic of discussion today in this panel, of course, is the phenomena of Christian persecution under various Islamic lands, particularly in the Middle East. And the panel with me here today, who I'll introduce later, are all going to discuss various hot spots where this is happening. I myself will discuss the situation for the Coptic Christians of Egypt. But first, I'd like to make some quick introductory remarks to try to put the whole thing into context. I like to bring it back to the Arab Spring, even though what we're going to discuss has been happening for a lot longer. The Arab Spring, ever since it's come about, has become, even though the media originally portrayed it as some sort of democratic movement, and to be sure there was elements of that who apparently got hijacked, but it's becoming more of an Islamic spring, or as others would call it, an Islamic winter, depending on who you talk to. And during this time of the Arab Spring, I'd like to talk, let's say, starting January 11, the plight of Christian minorities in the various Middle Eastern countries, and really not even just Middle Eastern countries, but anywhere Islamic countries, as far east as Pakistan and into sub-Saharan Africa, especially Nigeria, but other countries. The same sorts of patterns have been coming about of persecution. And it's interesting for me to always try to show that there's a lot of continuity involved in this, and it's not just an aberration. It is an aberration in the modern era, because in the last 150 years or even more, as a lot of Christians under Islam know, it was considered the golden age for Christians, Christian minorities, because there was a lot more secularism among Muslims, because it was also the time of colonialism, and there were a lot more freedoms. For example, the jizya, or the tax that Christians had to pay, was abolished in the 19th century. But so now we are returning sort of to a more historical Islam, especially the early Islam. And I like to start by discussing, you're probably, or you may not be familiar with the concept of Dhimmitude, which really means the word dhimmi, which is a legal term for non-Muslims who live under Islam. And the dhimmi, there are lots of rules for how they should be governed. And it really begins, according to Islamic scholars and Islamic tradition, with what's called the conditions of Omar, or commonly known as the Pact of Omar. And this would be the second caliph who made that pact with the conquered Christians of Jerusalem. Other people say it was in Syria. Other people say it wasn't even Omar, it was a later addition. These are scholarly points, but suffice to say, according to Islamic understanding, the Pact of Omar is a pivotal text that Dhimmitude, or the laws for dhimmis, were built upon. And the reason I bring it up is because even though this Pact of Omar is believed to have been ratified in the 7th century, and it was added on to later by different caliphs and of course the jurists, it makes mention of various items that are still relevant and we are seeing come back today. I'll just discuss two, and I will discuss those two in the context of Egypt, because Egypt to me is sort of the paradigm of Dhimmitude. And the reason I say that is because Egypt, from a historical point of view, was a primary Christian country. Most people aren't aware that it was really a Christian center, especially Alexandria actually vied with Rome as far as ecclesiastical authority. But when the Islamic conquest happened in the 7th century, and slowly, of course, Christians became minorities, but there's still a large number, and depending on who you ask, there's up to 15 million Christians in Egypt. And so the reason it becomes a paradigm of Dhimmitude is because there's so many Christians that you see the sort of laws coming up, because in other countries where there aren't that many, you won't see much of this because they're not there anyway. So the 2 points I'd like to discuss, or the paradigms, the first one is churches. When you look at the Pact of Omar and the subsequent dhimmi status laws that were built upon it, there's a great focus put on churches. And basically it got distilled down to churches could not be built, new ones, and old ones should be left to crumble away and they're not to be renovated. Now this, of course, with the vicissitudes of history, sometimes happened in a very dramatic way with lots of destruction, and other times it was more tolerant, and especially as I was mentioning during the colonial era or the golden age. But now it's coming back, and I'll just give you a quick list to give you an idea of how this happens. In the Pact of Omar, it specifically states not only can they not be built or renovated, but they should not have visible crosses, there should not be bells or loud singing, because that's offensive to Islam. And so one of the churches a few months ago called Merenib, which is near Edfu in Aswan, was a classic case of this. It was built 100 years ago and it was so dilapidated that they tried to fix it, the cops, and they actually got a permit for it. Local Muslims were not happy with this, and they started saying things like, we don't want to see a church on it, the dome needs to be taken down, Make a long story short, after Friday prayers, as often is the time when Muslim mobs will go and attack, they came and destroyed that church. And in fact, that was the one church that caused, you may know, the Maspero massacre. Because after that church was destroyed, Copts in mass protested, because this was not the first church, of course. A few months earlier, there was a church in Seoul, and it was an ancient church. And Muslims went up with sledgehammers, destroyed it, completely razed it to the ground, spent 10 hours doing that. Police forces didn't do anything. And Merenab, or that church in Edfu, was done again in very classical doctrine, because you're not supposed to renovate it, you're not supposed to put a cross, you're not supposed to have bells. And Muslims took the law in their own hands in that region. As for the Church of Seoul, that also has precedent. It was in the precedent, or the pretext for why it was attacked was because in the region a Coptic Christian man was accused of having a relationship with a Muslim woman. And that too is part of the Dhimma law, which means Christian men cannot marry Muslim women. And so it was part of a collective punishment. Because of that fact, Muslims rose, destroyed that church. Then there was the Imbaba churches, or the Imbaba riots a few months before that. And in this case, 2 or 3 churches were attacked and burned. And again, there was some pretext that wasn't even real. The pretext basically was that apparently some Coptic girl, wanted to convert to Islam, and Copts were preventing her. So Muslims rioted, destroyed 3 churches, and some Christians were killed. Then, of course, there's the New Year's attack. You may remember that. That's the one that actually made it to the mainstream media, where during midnight mass, the Church of Two Saints was attacked, 23 people killed. All of this happened right around the time of the Arab Spring, by the way. And, but it's also been happening before that, but it's coming back now with a passion. The other aspect that's very important is that while we can say under Mubarak, churches were attacked, because they have been, since the probably 1970s, hundreds have been attacked in Egypt. But there's a new theme that also traces back to the Dhimma laws and the Pact of Omar, which is this new idea of blasphemy codes. In Egypt now, whereas under Mubarak's reign, there were very, very minimal rare cases of Christians being accused of blasphemy, which is to say insulting or offending Muhammad. Today, there's approximately 17 cases. There were 18 cases, and this has all happened ever since Mubarak was ousted, and basically under Muslim Brotherhood auspices. Of the 18 cases, 17 of them are Christians. One was a Muslim, and he was exonerated. The other 17 are all either in jail or pending or waiting. One, for instance, was a pregnant woman who basically said something, and it was interpreted. A pregnant woman teacher who teaching said Prophet Muhammad, but she didn't finish it up by saying in Arabic, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which is basically peace and blessings upon him. This was construed as blasphemy, and because she's pregnant, she was left alone until she delivers the baby, and then she may well be tried. Another case was a teacher who on his Facebook account put something that was deemed insulting to Muhammad. He got 6 years. Another case, 17-year-old student. On his Facebook, he only has 130 friends. 130 friends. He put something, it was discovered, he got 3 years in jail. There's a lot more cases of this. And they're not unlike, you may have heard in Pakistan, the Rimsha case, the young Pakistani girl that was accused of tearing up a Quran. Same identical thing happened a couple of weeks ago. 2 little Coptic boys, I think 9 and 10, were accused of tearing up a Quran. Turned out that they're illiterate. They don't even know what the book was. It was in the garbage and it was already torn up. And there were riots and people wanted them arrested or worse. And it's important to keep in mind that whereas the churches, they're getting worse, the attacks on churches, and that this has a lot of continuity with Islamic history and tradition and doctrine, this blasphemy thing is very much a reflection of the new rule in Egypt, which is basically with the Islamization of Egypt and with the rise and prominence of the Salafis and of course the Muslim Brotherhood. Blasphemy, like I said, under Mubarak was not a prominent issue. You had a rare case every few years. Now in a few months we've already got 17. So the issue is obviously there, it's a real thing. Of course the problem is the mainstream is not aware of it because these topics rarely make it into the mainstream. And when they do, they're sort of watered down. I remember, for instance, the New Year's Eve church bombing where 23 people were killed. It's 23 church, middle of the night, worshiping. It was bombed, 23 people dead. And the New York Times headline was basically Muslims and Christians riot and clash. sectarian strife. So you read it and you get the impression that basically, well, it's an equal kind of conflict, and that's not the case at all. And of course, we're going to hear now from other people about different regions, who I'll be introducing shortly. And I think it's important to keep in mind as you listen to them that I'm talking about Egypt. They're going to talk about other countries, Iraq, Iran, and elsewhere. And it's interesting to note the parallels, the things that you will see. So what's happening in Iraq and Iran will be what's happening in Egypt. And it's even worse than that. You can leave the Arab world, go to Nigeria. Churches are probably daily attacked there by Boko Haram or Western Education, as I say, in the militant Islamic jihadi group. Go far into Pakistan, same exact thing. So these patterns are not aberrations, they're not cultural issues. They have a long tradition and they trace back to something else. And I think that's the big picture. At this point, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Juliana Taimurazi. She's an Assyrian Christian born in Iran, and she fled Iran and received asylum eventually. And she's the founder of the Iraqi Christian Relief Council, who helps try to empower various Christian minorities in Iraq and elsewhere.